All right. Hello, everybody. My name is David Whitesock, and I'm honored to spend a few minutes with you here this afternoon and this week during Construction Opioid Awareness Week, and proud and honored to be invited by Seth and the team at Keystone Contractors Association. And in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to sort of look at this issue of opioid addiction and substance use in a slightly different way, and talk about it through the lens of how do we actually measure whether or not an individual is well? How do we measure recovery? Through the course of this week, you've probably heard a number of really touching and hopeful and really remarkable stories about recovery. You've probably heard the other side of that, some sad stories of loss. But I want to talk about what does it look like if and when we are tracking and measuring well-being relative to someone's substance use in a data-driven kind of way. And show you some examples of the way we do that in our lives today. And we'll just ask the question: if we're tracking a lot of different things about our health and well-being, which seems pretty normal in a lot of different ways of our life, why can't we do that relative to addiction, whether it be opioids or alcohol or any other drug, as we're moving forward? And so that's our topic here today. I'll introduce myself here in just a moment, but just kind of give you a high level of my why. I as you'll learn, I have a personal connection to addiction. And I'm really interested in how we can actually solve the addiction problems that we have across the United States. And they're very complex. We have different pathologies and biologies and the way that different drugs interact with us. Addiction maybe not is just tied to substances, but it can also be tied to behaviors. And so there's a lot of ways that we can think about this, but my belief is we have to sort of think about it a little bit differently. And so if we really want to solve the addiction problem, I think we'll solve it when we don't solve for addiction. And I'll tell you what that means as we kind of go along here. So let me just quickly introduce myself. Like I said, my name is David Whitesock, and I am the founder of a new technology and behavioral design startup company called Commonly Well. And Commonly Well is really born out of this idea of we'll solve addiction when we don't solve for addiction. It's this idea that if you were to reverse engineer, I know we're talking to a lot of folks in the construction industry. And so if you reverse engineer the thing that's already been built, and let's just put addiction at the end of that thing that we've built. So we've got somebody struggling with addiction. And if we just go backwards in time for that person's life and just take it back step by step by step by step by step, what we'll come to learn is that at some point in some part of that person's life, addiction wasn't even a gleam in that person's eye. Okay, so what was there at that time that kept addiction, if you will, at bay? And then as we move forward in the timeline, we can ask, okay, well, why did addiction take hold? What were the things that were contributing to that? And as you'll hear here in the next few minutes or so, a lot of those things are probably not the usual suspects. It may not just be that someone really enjoyed drinking a lot, or somebody necessarily got back pain from an injury and then all of a sudden were addicted to opioids. There could be a whole lot of other things involved there. And so as you look around your community, as you look around the places where you're building the buildings and constructing the world that all of us live in, what are some of those systems and designed elements that either contribute to the well-being of people or don't? And what I mean by maybe don't is if you've ever lived in some large sprawling cities where you have to drive 40, 50 minutes, maybe over an hour just to get to your job. We know a lot of science says that long-term commutes are really bad for one's health. Now, you might be going to a place of work with great purpose and meaning in your life, but there's an imbalance sometimes, especially over long periods of time, when certain commutes like that contribute to individuals' lack of well-being. So those are the types of things that I'm talking about. And you might be saying, "Oh, but David, that has nothing to do with addiction." Well, one thing that we do know about addiction is it is progressive. There are some substances which are almost instantly addictive, but that's a little bit different. And typically we go through a process of dependence and then addiction. And so there are underlying factors. There are, as you've probably heard other speakers talk about, there may be protective factors that exist that can keep us well. Some of us may never even know it, but we're protected. Others maybe don't have that benefit. So that's who I am. That's what I'm trying to do. And we're trying to do that in a lot of different ways. And one of the first ways that we're doing that is by actually measuring recovery. So we have tens of millions of people who have experienced addiction. And we have tens of millions of people who have experienced the opposite of that, recovery or well-being or wellness, or they survived in some way, shape, or form. And the question becomes, what was that experience? And can we actually measure it? And then can we, for those that are providing care, whether they're counselors or therapists or traditional addiction treatment, maybe medical doctors as well, can we have a standard measure of recovery? And then as we take that from an individual, can we have a standard representation of what recovery looks like in a community? So can we see well-being across an entire community? I think the answer to that is yes. And I'll show you what that actually looks like as we go along. So the Recovery Capital Index is a tool that I invented in a previous work of mine with an organization that provides peer coaching. And in this organization where I was providing peer coaching, we had a request from a funder who said, they were a hospital system and they loved the stories that you hear of redemption and hope and people overcoming addiction and these stories of recovery. They really loved those stories. But what they said very bluntly to us was, none of those stories are data. We need data. And so it became my task to go and find a way to measure recovery. And so starting back in 2012 and 2013, we dove in, we talked to a lot of experts, and over the course of about four and a half years, we developed an instrument that has 68 questions. That's the fullness of the scale. There's also a 36 question version and a 10 question version. All of them, though, score addiction recovery in a comprehensive way across a 100-point scale. And we do the survey every 30 days. Now, by doing the survey every 30 days, and not just at the time that you enter a treatment program, not at the time that you leave a treatment program, but forget about any intervention, any treatment, anything. If we do this every 30 days, and there are interventions applied along the way, we have a pulse of a person's recovery capital. Recovery capital is really the things that are inherent to us. So, or the assets, if you will, that are inside us, or the assets external to us, the internal and external resources, if you will, that can help or hinder our well-being. Now, all of us have those. So if you've never experienced addiction in your life, you have assets in your life that help or hinder your well-being. Those are the exact same assets that individuals who struggle with addiction have. It's just that the intensity of some of those resources, like employment or housing or transportation or some of these other things, is ratcheted up a few notches. And so if we can find out which ones are having the most impact and measure it and track it over time, not only can we know exactly where to go to help individuals really hone in on the underlying issues that are sort of keeping them back, if you will, but then we can also measure that at scale. And we can sort of start to figure out, okay, what resources in our community do we need to reallocate dollars or effort toward? And so we validated the survey. We went through a number of years of testing it, and then sent it off to the biostatisticians, the experts, to test it. Does it measure what we say it measures? Meaning, if you identify as somebody who's struggling and you have a score, say, of 50, and then over some period of time, you then change your description of your well-being to, say, somebody in recovery or survived or survivor, your score, we can predict that your score will go up. It'll be higher than 50. And so we validated that. So why do I care about this? Just sort of dive a little bit into sort of the why. Why do we need this? And why is it, I guess, in this particular instance, important to me? Let me just pause on that for a half a second and just say this. When we talk about the importance of being able to track or measure things, we're tracking and measure things in a lot of places in our life. This, by the way, is what you're seeing, a measurement of recovery capital of somebody's life well over the course of a year. Now, some people might have in their head that, or you might have been thinking in your head, that recovery is sort of this process that starts at a low point and just kind of progressively goes up. Well, frankly, nobody's recovery does that, and nobody's life does that. Life isn't like that. We don't just start at the bottom and go up. It doesn't work like that. This, what you see on the screen, is actually what a person's recovery looks like. There are ups and there are downs, and sometimes there's big downs. But this is what it would look like over the course of a year. Now, this happens, if you will, to look a lot like some other measurements that we might be using in our life. So like with wearables, tracking our steps on an Apple Watch, that on the left-hand side, we're constantly tracking our steps. It's happening. We got that data coming in, and I can see my step count, or this person can see their step count, is lower than it was the year before. Over on the right, if we get on a bike or a cycling system, we can track our speed and our output. And so we've got these measures, right? And these are individual timed measures over some period of time. And they're tracking off of objective sources. Recovery capital is a subjective source, meaning I or you have to answer particular questions. But it would just be like, the bike that you see on the example on the right. That's a question and an answer going back and forth. The question is, how fast are the pedals moving, and what is the pressure on those pedals, the resistance, and that creates output. Okay, so subjectively, what is my understanding or satisfaction with employment and relative to recovery or well-being? We get an output, a response to that. It's objective when we put it over time. So that's sort of the context right there. So let me just tell you a little bit more about why this is in particular important to me. That's me back in 2005. And this is at the end, if you will, of a 12-year history struggling with addiction, depression, anxiety. I'm in jail now for, at this time, a 5th DUI lifetime. This was in the state of South Dakota. It was actually a 3rd offense felony DUI. But what's really important about this is over the course of those 12 years, my addiction was really, really bad at times, took me to some very dark places, but I was also very functional at times. For about 8 years, I had a career in radio and broadcasting, one that was excelling in a lot of ways, but kept back because of my addiction. But in this particular moment, as everything kind of came to an end, it was in the sentencing with the judge who, looked back at those 12 years, and she looked back on a whole series of events, and she asked in open court during the sentencing, how did you get here? How did you, somebody with your skill set, somebody who's worked professionally in a profession of radio and journalism for nearly a decade, somebody who has gone to college, I went to school to become an architect, had 6 years of schooling, but failed out multiple times. Somebody who had family, who was in the courtroom there, had access to financial resources. She was asking all of these questions, and she just couldn't understand how I could be in her courtroom to the extent that I was in her courtroom. And so she said to me, look, I can't do much for you. I could put you in prison, but I think that'll kill you. Either you'll die being in prison, or you'll become so corrupted and so rotted that by the time you come out, you just won't be, a useful human being to society. These are the types of words that she was actually using in my sentencing. And so she tore up the plea agreement and she said, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you in my jail for 180 days. I will suspend 2 years in prison. While you're in my jail, you're going to go to treatment as well. And I want you to think about what you want to do with the next year of your life. If you do the treatment, if you come to me with a plan, a really solid plan for the next year of your life, I'll let you out of jail early. So that was the carrot. Stick obviously was prison. But she also said, if I let you go and when I let you out of my jail, you are going to go to AA meetings once a day for 5 years. And you're going to do twice daily breathalyzers for 5 years. Well, I would do twice daily breathalyzers for about 2.5 years. I moved to a sober home in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And it was kind of in that moment where I met a few different people and they talked me into going back to college, which I did. Thought I was going to go back into radio and broadcasting, but got sidetracked because a constitutional law professor, it was an elective class, she was a public offender, and she said, David, you need to become a lawyer. And of course, I rejected that a lot of different ways. I didn't think I was smart enough. I was a convicted felon, all of those things. But she made it pretty clear that, there are very few people who are lawyers that are there advocating for individuals who have been blacked out, and when they woke up were on the floor of a holding cell, not once, but twice or 10 times. There are very few lawyers who have gone through the system like I had. And she says, you need to be a lawyer. And that was convincing. And so after 2.5 years, was able to graduate and get into law school, thanks to that professor's help, Sandy McEwen. And I went to law school, graduated, got my degree, passed the bar exam. But in that process, of course, to become a practicing lawyer, you've got to prove your good moral character to the Board of Bar Examiners. That was a year-long process, but ultimately we were successful. And the state Supreme Court of South Dakota said, we will go ahead and let you come in to practice law in the state of South Dakota. And so I got to go back to that same courtroom where I was sentenced with the same judge, Kathleen Trandle. And instead of wearing orange, got to stand up and swear an oath of attorney in the state of South Dakota. And that was in 2013. Now, in the course of those 8 years, actually, from leaving jail and then ending up back in this courtroom again, a lot of things happened. Obviously, I didn't consume alcohol or drugs anymore. I did a lot of counseling and a lot of therapy. I met new friends, rekindled relationships with family. I got married, got a dog. Life kind of got back together. I didn't actually go to practice law, but I did find a profession, a job with meaning and purpose, and something that was built upon a whole series of opportunities that allowed me to find what my purpose was going to be. And if you're listening to that story and you're just waiting to hear, David, tell us, how many days sober are you? How many years? When was the last time you had a drink or a drug? I'm not going to tell you. It's not that it isn't important, but there are so many more factors that contribute to the fact that, yes, I am sober. I haven't used alcohol or drugs in nearly 16 years, but it's all of these other contributing factors that keep that at bay. Now, in that same story, you wouldn't necessarily say the same thing to somebody with diabetes. A person who has diabetes, they can't constantly be, if you will, sugar-free or keep certain things out of their system. They're constantly relapsing, if you will, to use the term that we apply to addiction. But yet the stigma around society is not the same. And so by measuring my recovery capital, we can show you, and I can show you, what it actually looks like when there are recurrences of symptoms. Now, not necessarily a recurrence of using again, but if you look through February and June of 2020, obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic at that time. My life changed dramatically at that time. I moved from Denver, Colorado to the Adirondacks of Northern New York. I switched jobs. I left the job I was in for about 8 years, and then I started my own company. And so that was a big, huge change, a lot of anxiety, a lot of change of social networks. But because I was measuring this every 30 days, now all of a sudden I've got this pulse. And this is not just of an individual who's quote unquote in early recovery, where supposedly we should have the most of our focus. There are a lot of people who are 5, 10, 20, 30 years, quote unquote, in recovery, who may be struggling, but not really knowing what's going on. But here's what this looks like. And then again, in October, there's another little dip. But in the middle of all of that, what you see from July to April that's what resilience looks like. So over the course of 8, 9, 10 years, I've built a lot of tools. I've brought in a lot of different things into my life, like a lot of people in recovery do, whether it be 12-step meetings or meditation or exercise or new social groups, whatever it is, job, family, whatever. All of those things contribute to us being resilient for when the next time a big disruption in our life comes, like a pandemic, changing jobs, starting a new company. Some of that stuff can really disrupt people and send them, if you will, back into their addiction. But when you have resilience, you can stay the course. So that's what that looks. That's what I mean. This is an example of one, but that's what that looks like on an individual level. But let me show you what measuring beyond a substance looks like when we take it to a much higher level, say a county level. So this is Palm Beach County, Florida. If you do any reading about addiction or recovery, it is the epicenter of a lot of treatment and a lot of recovery in the United States, good and bad, frankly. And they know that, but they want to change some of the perceptions in that county. And so what we're doing is we're applying the recovery capital in every place, the recovery capital index in every place that we can. And this is what recovery capital looked like for about 5 or 6 facilities in Palm Beach County for hundreds of people who were coming through those doors during the course of the pandemic. And as you can see, there's a lot of variance, around that March, April, May timeframe. Obviously, a lot of things were happening and being challenged during that time. But now there's something else going on kind of as we move forward, and a big, huge dip in the early part of 2021. But the thing about this is those providers that are part of that network and the county itself, they're now monitoring this. They're monitoring this in real time. And they're having real-time, real-world conversations based upon the input from individuals in the throes of their own addiction or in recovery, who are telling them, these are the things in my community that are either helping or hindering me from getting out of this mess and improving my life. And so now the accountability flow isn't just from a person of power, say a therapist or somebody else, or the county. It is now both ways. The accountability structure goes back and forth. It's a 2-lane highway. And it's a whole new conversation that we're starting to have and that they're starting to have at the county level and the city level in Palm Beach, Florida. One thing that came out of this, and as we get close to the end of our conversation here, is in the Recovery Capital Index, there are 68 questions. And In the middle set of questions, we talk about something called social capital. And as you've probably heard in the news, if you've been paying attention, a lot of stories have been coming up over the last 2 years, frankly, about isolation and loneliness. Now, isolation and loneliness got ratcheted up in the last year and a half, obviously because of the pandemic. However, with individuals who are struggling with addiction, one of the core symptoms is a removal from social connections. Now, as we were measuring recovery capital for all these individuals in Palm Beach County over the course of 2020, one of the questions in the survey is the isolation and loneliness question. And what the question is asking is, if you and I are friends and we talk on a regular basis, I will know when something's a little bit off with you. You'll know when something's a little bit off with me. If I don't necessarily have close relations like that, I'm going to respond negatively to this question that I can count on my friends or social networks when things go wrong. Meaning, if I'm talking to you and something just seems off, you're going to say to me, David, something just doesn't seem right. Are you okay? Well, for this group of people, nearly 83% of the population said they didn't think they had somebody close enough to them that could help them if something went wrong. That's a crisis of isolation and loneliness in the middle of an epidemic of addiction, of especially heroin in Palm Beach County, in the middle of a global pandemic. And now the county is doing some different things because they now have this knowledge. And so this is way beyond just whether or not people are using or not using substances. This is the heart of the reason why people are in despair and probably why they're self-medicating in the first place. So just to wrap up, when we think about this idea of recovery capital, we're thinking about this core construct of well-being. Recovery and recovery capital, these are really umbrella terms that are kind of getting after this idea of well-being, or flip it around even. Well-being is an umbrella term, and inside that we have this notion of recovery capital. And for a long time, because we've focused recovery, if you will, on abstinence efforts and these sorts of things, and in certain areas, abstinence might be absolutely a path that has to be taken, for health considerations and other things. But for a lot of people, sometimes that might not necessarily be the most beneficial path forward. But so we can look at the other things in people's lives as to the reason why we might be using certain substances. And so recovery capital gives us a much wider view of those things in life, whether they're internal to me or external, coming from the community, that can be helpful for me. So how can you help? You all are builders, you're people in the construction, and you are out there building the environments in which we live. You are at the heart of building communities that are strong and stable and affordable and meaningful for all of us to live in. And when we have really good places to live, and what I mean by good places is that they are stable, they're safe, they're close to the resources and the things that we need, like education and food and recreation and social and cultural benefits. Think about how you fit in that construct of, as you're creating this built environment in which we live. And you could ask questions of yourself. Obviously, if you're a person who makes decisions and leads the direction and strategy for organizations or companies, ask yourself, if we build this like we're building it now, is it contributing to separation and disconnection? Is this creating an inequitable framework, or does it maintain the status quo that seems to contribute to some of these challenges that we might have in our community? And I know some of those are big questions, and you can't probably solve them, but they're questions that we should ask nonetheless. But you might be right in the heart of that. And I'll just give you an example. If I ask that question back to me, how can I help? Of course, I'm doing a lot of these other things, but for instance, in my new community that I live, I'm working with a group to make our streets better and more passable. So sidewalks, so that there are sidewalks, everywhere, so that people can be mobile and walkable around our small community, our village. Bike paths, so people that can use different transportation and get around. It can be very frustrating if, say, you lose a license and now all of a sudden you've got to cross highways and interstates just to get to a place you need to get to. That's dangerous and frustrating. And that could contribute, and I can just speak for myself, to somebody having a relapse. So think, how can you help in the fact that you're a builder and somebody in the construction of these environments in which we live? So thank you for listening to this slightly different conversation during this focused effort on Opioid Week and how it's impacting the industry in particular, but just sort of branching it out a little bit further and seeing that there are so many different things that stack up along the way that either contribute to the well-being of people or hinder individuals from maximizing their well-being. If you have any questions, that's my contact information. Please feel free to send me an email or my phone number. That's my mobile number. Don't hesitate to call it or even text it. So thank you to KCA and the Keystone Group for inviting me to provide this presentation. I'm truly grateful. Thank you.